The Second World War. For 6 years, Britain faced the fight of its life. This was a total war, and it reached every corner of Britain and British life. I'm Arthur Williams, a pilot and former Royal Marine who is fascinated by the Second World War. In this series, I'm going to travel the length and breadth of Britain to discover the places and people who helped us win the war. I'll walk the paths and byways to get a different perspective and make some fascinating discoveries. I'll uncover some of Britain's finest moments, as well as some that we'd sooner forget. This time, I'm in Hampshire. This county may be famous for yachting, but during World War II, this part of Britain was packed with secret operations to help the war effort. It became a training ground for spies.
So the Special Operations Executive was given the order to set Europe ablaze.
A testbed for wonder weapons.
Suddenly there was a big bang and all his doors and windows flew open.
And a home to covert factories.
But the Spitfire could be partly assembled in someone's backyard or bedroom.
Together, they made a huge, but largely forgotten, contribution to the overall success of the Allies. My walk through Hampshire begins in Southampton, the birthplace of the Spitfire. I'll travel to Salisbury to investigate the story of the secret factories. I'll walk across the New Forest to uncover a hidden bombing range. And I'll head to Beaulieu to find a finishing school for Churchill's secret spies. But I'm starting my journey in Russell Place on the outskirts of Southampton. This might seem like an ordinary leafy suburb, but it was right here that an icon was born. On this street lived a man who is one of Britain's greatest unsung heroes of the Second World War, Reginald Joseph Mitchell, otherwise known as the designer of the Spitfire. The most widely produced and strategically important plane of the war, the Spitfire has gone down as one of the greatest inventions in British history. Over 20,000 of these aeroplanes were built in just 10 years, and without them, the Battle of Britain may have ended very differently. Although the Spitfire is the most celebrated achievement made by wartime Hampshire, it's by no means the only one. Many other contributions were kept top secret and hidden away from the watchful eyes of the Nazis. From Russell Place, I'm wandering 2 miles south towards the marina to find out how the Spitfire came about. Although the city was heavily bombed during the war, down near the waterfront, you can still walk around Southampton's medieval walls and ancient castle gateways, reminders of Britain's resolve to resist invasion. In 1931, out there, above the water just off Southampton, Britain made history. For years, European countries and the United States had been competing in seaplane races that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible. The shining star of the competition soon turned out to be hotshot designer R.J. Mitchell, whose aeroplanes won the competition 3 times in a row. Mitchell's planes had such superiority that in 1931 the Schneider Cup was permanently awarded to Great Britain. Later that year, the Royal Air Force put out a call for a brand new fighter plane, one that would replace their existing biplanes. Mitchell was confident. That confidence was misplaced as Mitchell's design turned out to be slow and generally quite disappointing, and as a result of that, the RAF awarded the contract to another company. Frustrated, Mitchell went back to the drawing board. What he came up with was revolutionary, and it can still be seen down by the marina in Southampton's Solent Sky Museum. Well, here she is, the Supermarine Spitfire, and what a beautiful aeroplane it is, of course. Built by the company Supermarine, who came from a background of building not cargo aircraft or bombers, but thoroughbred racing aeroplanes. And that was the background unto which the Spitfire was born. She's got this beautiful elliptical wing that we're all so used to seeing in the skies above us at air shows and things like this, and give the Spitfire its character. But it was a very important wing because it gave it its manoeuvrability and its handling that all of the pilots speak so highly of. The Spitfire first took to the skies above Southampton on the 5th of March 1936. It soon became clear it was something special. Alan Jones is an expert on Mitchell's wonder plane. How badly did the RAF need the Spitfire?
Well, in 1936, our frontline fighter was a biplane, and obviously it was no competition to what was happening in Germany when they were developing all-metal, very fast fighters, and therefore it was very important indeed that we did end up with a high-speed fighter.
What did the RAF first think of the Spitfire when they saw it?
Well, I think there was some scepticism about the aircraft. We've certainly got some correspondence to say that two of the test pilots weren't very happy with it. But it wasn't long before they realised, of course, it was an absolute thoroughbred, and it was proved very, very quickly that the aircraft was not only suitable for the job, but was way above anything else that had been produced at the time. It was used as our frontline fighter throughout the entire war.
Was it a particularly easy aeroplane to produce?
The Spitfire was extremely difficult to build. All-metal aircraft, and you appreciate at those times they didn't have the presses to press out a lot of the skins of the fuselage, etc., and they were all handmade. And in particular, the leading edges of the wings were extremely difficult to make because they were very tight, because the important thing here, of course, it was a very thin wing, so everything about it was quite difficult. Prior to the order for the Spitfire, they'd only produced 12 of any particular airplane. And the factory here at Wartime was employing about 500 people. So you can imagine suddenly getting an order for 300 was stunning. The fact is, of course, that they just simply weren't used to doing that sort of work. As time went on, of course, they got more and more familiar with how to do it, and presses were introduced, etc. And in the end, they were producing them really very fast. In fact, at the end of the day, some 26,000.
It's almost like a Formula One team before the war turning into a mass car producer during it.
Well, exactly. It was a good analysis, yeah.
But the Spitfire didn't exactly get off to a flying start. In the early days of the war, the Hawker Hurricane, which was much less advanced but easier to produce, was the RAF's favoured fighter, and the Spitfire remained largely untested against the Luftwaffe. But when France fell in 1940, Spitfires were sent over to protect the evacuation of Dunkirk. This was the first time most Luftwaffe pilots had faced them. And although the Me-109s outgunned them, they couldn't outmaneuver them. Design tweaks followed. Supermarine increased the plane's firepower and top speed, giving the Spitfire the upper hand by the time the Battle of Britain was fought. How important was it to helping Britain win the war?
I'd put it this way. If we hadn't had a Spitfire, we wouldn't have won the Battle of Britain. No question about that. You can argue whether the Hurricane was better or the Spitfire was better, but if the Spitfire hadn't been there, we simply wouldn't have won it. Now, if we'd not won the Battle of Britain, the chances are that we would have been invaded. No question about it. Had we been invaded, there would not have been a platform for the Americans to come here and help us go over to D-Day. We'd have lost the war.
Sadly, R.J. Mitchell didn't get to see his plane change the course of the war. Diagnosed with cancer, he died on the 11th of June 1937, aged just 42. He died a year before Spitfires entered service with the RAF proper, but he did see the prototypes fly, and he did insist, as he was dying, on watching many of the test flights take place, and people still brought him drawings as he was on his deathbed for his opinion and to give a sign-off on. This is a man that must have known he was onto something very special, and he was. The Spitfire is a beautiful aeroplane, and has a lot to say about the outcome of the Second World War. And because of that, we owe R.J. Mitchell a lot. I'm in Southampton, the birthplace of the Spitfire. Although it had a bit of a bumpy start, the Spitfire soon became vitally important to Britain's survival in the war. But that importance put a target on Southampton's back. When the Battle of Britain began in May 1940, every single Spitfire that the RAF scrambled to intercept German bombers was built right here in Southampton. And it didn't take the Nazis long to figure that out, and when they did, the Supermarine factories became a key target. From the Solent Sky Museum, I'm walking across the river to Woolston via the Itchen toll bridge. Completed in 1977, it replaced the antiquated cable ferry. It's 80 pence for cars, but free to us pedestrians. During the war, Supermarine's Spitfire factory here in Woolston became a prime target. And between August and September 1940, the German bombs got closer and closer. After several near misses, on the afternoon of the 26th of September, 100 Nazi bombers and fighters finally struck the Woolston works. They were completely destroyed. The site today is much smaller than it was during the 1940s, from what I can tell of wartime photographs. And actually there's very little that remains to give away the fact that this site produced hundreds of Spitfires. 17 staff were killed in the final raid, but it's a miracle things weren't worse. Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister for Aircraft Production, had become so fed up with delays that he ordered Supermarine's workers to stay put until the bombs actually started falling. Can you imagine just how terrifying it must have been for the workers of the factory here as they tried to escape whilst the German bombs are falling from overhead, and they were landing right in and around here where I'm sat now, trying to get out of the factory down narrow corridors, down stairs, and even when they get out they've got to make their way to the nearest air raid shelter, which is over by the railway station over there, and it's not close. And some reports of workers throwing themselves on their colleagues in order to try to protect their lives. It must have been pandemonium. Days after the factory was destroyed, Lord Beaverbrook returned to assess the damage. He ordered the factory closed, but he wasn't done. Somewhat brusquely, he informed them that Spitfires still needed to be made, and that production would have to be shipped out to the local area. Supermarine drew a series of concentric rings circulating out from Southampton and started searching for nearby sites to produce Spitfires. Salisbury, Newbury, Reading and Trowbridge became new centres for Spitfire production alongside Southampton. But dispersing production wasn't enough for Beaverbrook, and he came up with a madcap plan to outwit the Nazis. Spitfires would no longer be built in one place. Instead, components would be assembled piecemeal in bus garages, garden sheds, and even laundrettes, scattered across the new towns, and then brought to secret factories solely for final assembly. From Southampton, I'm catching a 30-minute train to Salisbury, one of the new Spitfire locations. From the station, it's a gentle stroll through the picturesque medieval city. Salisbury escaped the worst of Hitler's bombs, largely because the Luftwaffe used the cathedral's towering spire as a waymarker en route to the Midlands. From the cathedral, I'm walking 2 miles north to the edge of the city to meet engineer Norman Parker, who worked on the Spitfire. So Norman, I'd imagine moving from a factory where everything's running smoothly to lots of different locations would have had a big impact on the manufacturing process.
Oof, it was a nightmare. Logistically, it was. We had fleets of vehicles delivering spares and component parts around. We had vehicles that, during the course of the war, would have been serviced and 4 or 5 engines had been fitted, but they wore them out. They were in use. They never got cold.
Really?
They were in use 24 hours a day.
With all these different locations, you know, who were the people that actually ended up building the aircraft?
Anyone that was capable was used. People from London were working in here in Salisbury. They were directed down here. When they arrived, they had no knowledge of what they were going to do, but they were simply trained to do a job, a role. Riveters were told how to rivet, and more importantly, how not to rivet. But then, as they gained experience, they were fed into other jobs, and by the end of the war, many of them were skilled workers.
What was the gender makeup of the workforce for Spitfires?
About 60% were female. They were initially trained to do probably one function, but over the years they moved on to other work and so on. Eventually they were fitting in wiring, component parts within the aircraft and so on.
Norman, what was your specific job on the Spitfire?
All of them. All of it.
Everything?
Oh, you didn't have a job. Whatever was required, you just did.
You just did everything?
Yeah. You didn't have a role to play. You had an aeroplane that wanted fixing, so you fixed it.
Was shipping production out to remote areas a success?
The dispersal was a 120% successful. All the experts said it couldn't be done. A modern aeroplane couldn't be built in that way, but the Spitfire, manufactured from many hundreds of small components, could be partly assembled in someone's backyard or bedroom. In fact, we know that happened.
You know, with all of the turnover of people here and the lots of different locations, I find it amazing that the Germans never got wind of this.
It wasn't talked about.
So if I put a Spitfire here on the lawn, could you just put one together?
Yeah, no problem. Absolutely no problem at all.
That's the blitz-winning attitude, isn't it?
Well, yeah, given the requisite bits.
Once the core Spitfire components had been manufactured, they were brought to secret factories for final assembly. Norman has arranged access to one of the few that survive. Oh wow, Norman, this place has got a feel about it like it hasn't changed since the 1940s.
Well, the building hasn't changed, but the contents have.
What do you think we would have seen in here then when all these Spitfires were being put together?
In that corner over there were the wing jigs, where they were building wings. But to make a wing, you had lots of component parts, and they were being fed in from other sites in this area. And in general, this whole building was just a mass of benches and people working on them, making bits and pieces, because that was the beauty of the Spitfire, made up to lots of little pieces that could be built anywhere, assembled somewhere like this, and then put the wings on.
A real hive of activity.
Oh, it was, yeah. Between March 41 and the end of 45, he built 2,295 Spitfires.
Wow, that's a lot, isn't it?
And at one stage, they were doing them at 40 aircraft a month.
To say that you worked on the Spitfires, I'm very jealous, actually. It's a beautiful aeroplane, but thank you for working on them and doing all that you did.
It's been a pleasure. It's been my life's activities, if you like.
The Spitfire factories weren't the only things hidden away in Hampshire. My journey is taking me south to the New Forest Range in the New Forest National Park. With 140 miles of tracks and footpaths to explore, the New Forest is the perfect spot for short strolls or long-distance hikes, and one of these trails conceals a forgotten wartime secret. It's easy to imagine that the war completely bypassed this part of the country, but although it looks untouched, there are still signs that lead you to believe everything's not quite as it seems. This giant concrete arrow was built to guide aircraft into the landscape below, because during the war, this 5,000-acre site became a secret bombing range. Waiting for the bombers were concrete hangars, parts of ships, and even mocked-up railway lines so that the Allies could test their latest and greatest inventions. Many of these were designed by the legendary bouncing bomb inventor Barnes Wallis. Fresh from the success of the Dam Busters raid, Barnes Wallis came here to test a land version of the bouncing bomb. And it was also here that Wallis and 617 Squadron came to test the biggest bombs that Britain had in her wartime arsenal, the earthquake bombs. On the 13th of March 1945, officials gathered here to test Wallis's £22,000 earthquake bomb, known as the Grand Slam. Dropped from a specially modified Lancaster bomber, it exploded, leaving a massive crater 130 foot wide and 70 foot deep. To this day, it's the largest bomb ever dropped on British soil. After the war, the story of what happened here was covered up and many of the bomb craters filled in. But there is one top secret location that remains. On first glance, it's not that obvious what this mound is. But after exhaustive research, local historian Henry Cole has unearthed the hump's secrets.
So Henry, why have we come to a big mound in the middle of nowhere?
Well, it's actually a building. It's a reinforced concrete building 70 foot by 79 with a 6 foot thick roof on it.
So there's a concrete structure under here. You can't really see anything. It looks more like, I don't know, Bronze Age mound.
Well, does show up on an Ordnance Survey map as a tumulus, because at the end of the war they just covered it up because it was so solid. There was no way of destroying it. And it's only just the last few years that the concrete started to edge through.
And what was it?
It was the first full-scale building of an experimental above-ground bomb shelter for the general public. Back in the 30s, the government realised that when war did happen, which was on the cards, that there would be a lot of danger from air attacks to the general population. And one of the things that they came up with was an above-ground air raid shelter that would withstand a direct hit from a 500-pound general-purpose bomb.
On the 12th of May 1943, the strength of the New Forest shelter was put to the test. An American flying fortress loaded with 500-pound bombs took to the Hampshire skies and began its bombing run.
The requirements were that the aircraft had to be at 12,000 feet, flying at 200 miles an hour, and hit this. On the 15th attempt, there was a loud cheer when they hit it, but they were starting to get the hang of it.
So aside from the shelter, Henry, is there any evidence of bomb craters around?
There's one to your left. It's a waterhole. It's probably about 3 or 4 feet deep. It's now brilliant for wildlife and great for dragonflies. Another small one there.
Oh, yeah.
Then over, we can't quite see it from here, is the crater for the test of the Grand Slam bomb.
Well, if it's the Grand Slam, it's probably that valley there. That's the
pretty close. That was tested in March 1945. The first, one and only live test in the UK, biggest munition ever to be dropped on UK soil.
And they fell supersonic in the fall. You'd have felt the shockwave from that bomb throughout the county.
Yes. An old forester was telling me that all the houses were supposed to be warned about the dropping of this, but they missed his house out. And suddenly there was a big bang and all his doors and windows flew open, and his mum got quite upset about it. It was designed to work. It didn't have to hit things exactly. It just knocked them down by pure shock waves.
Just sheer brute force, isn't it?
And then the next day, they dropped one for real on Bielefeld's viaduct in Germany. And they've been trying to knock it down for 4 or 5 years, and they succeeded a matter of weeks before the end of the war.
Testing at the bombing range continued until 1946, but in 1948 it was decommissioned and tons of explosives removed. Ironically, it's now one of the most tranquil parts of the New Forest.
Do you know, when I was a boy, and even still today, I'm fascinated by bombs and explosives, and as a kid I used to go in exploration of bomb craters that were apparently in my local area up in Worcestershire. But it's really important, of course, that we mustn't forget that the weapons that were being tested here would ultimately be used against people.
I'm in Hampshire, travelling through the New Forest National Park. I've already seen how this wooded area of Britain concealed the Allies' secret bombing range. Now I'm zigzagging my way south to one of the New Forest's timber plantations to discover how the trees themselves cleared a path to victory.
Timber was critical during the war. It was used for pretty much everything, from telegraph poles to even building aeroplanes. But Britain had a problem. We imported the vast majority of our wood, and sure, we had stockpiles when war broke out, but realistically we only had enough to last about 7 months. So just like that, all of these forests and these trees became a very valuable commodity.
Initially, the government planned to use prisoners, conscientious objectors, and even schoolboys to fell the trees. When that failed, they were forced to turn to Plan B: women. These women became known as the Lumberjills, and author Joe Fote has spent years documenting these forgotten heroines.
I've never heard of the Lumberjills before. Were they like a division of the Land Army or something?
Yes, originally they were recruited through the Women's Land Army purely because the authorities didn't think that the women could do the job. So it was very much, they were recruited kind of through the back door. And it was only about 2 years later, in April 1942, that a Women's Timber Corps was actually set up.
Why was there this reluctance to use women for forestry?
Well, it was thought of at the time as being a man's job, so they really didn't think that women were up for it. They didn't think they'd be strong enough. They were the fairer sex, so they were reluctant to give over their jobs to the women.
What did they do to appease the sceptics?
Well, when somebody tells you, we don't think you can do this, I think there's something within you that wants to fight back, don't you?
I know, you're speaking to a man in a wheelchair.
Well, I think that really kind of fired them up. And there's stories of the women working in the middle of winter in a snow blizzard to prove to the men that they could do the job. There was one lady called Bella, and she heard her foreman saying, I don't think much of these women. And so she said, well, I'll challenge you to a duel then with a cross-cut saw. You work one end and I'll work the other. And so the next day they worked all day and they had felled 120 trees together.
That's ridiculous.
Yes.
All by hand?
All by hand, yeah. There was no chainsaws until the 1950s.
So if you'd just become a lumberjill, what would your typical day look like?
Well, they'd pack their beetroot sandwiches and then they'd set off probably about 8 o'clock into the forest. They would literally be working out with a cross-cut saw and an axe. It was very skillful work using an axe, and the girls were very good at it because it required skill rather than brute force. And then the cross-cut saw work was done in pairs, so they would hold either end of a cross-cut saw and then they would work on their knees, which looks so awkward, pulling from side to side like that. Once the tree is down, they have to work on chopping off all the branches to prepare it, just the trunk. They would all then get together to load the trunks up onto lorries, and that was all done by hand, so just very heavy manual work. And in the winter, absolutely grueling and, you know, incredibly hard.
Was it a dangerous job?
It was very dangerous, yes, in more than one way. So If you were felling, there was the risk of trees falling irregularly, twisting and rolling, and quite a few of the ladies had trees that would kind of land, you know, on their backs, and there were a few women that died as a result of that. And then there was the sawmill work. A lot of the men just refused point blank to do that because it was so dangerous, because you would lose your fingers and hands if you were unlucky. And one of the ladies I met, Mary, she had lost her thumb on the sawmill.
Seriously?
Yeah. And yeah, it was just really dangerous.
How many lumberjills worked in and around the New Forest where we are today?
There was hundreds that worked here over the course of the war. It was one of the powerhouses of timber production during World War II, with 26 sawmills, and they felled half the trees in the New Forest during World War II.
What did the locals think of the lumberjills?
They weren't entirely happy about it. I mean, to begin with, it was very unusual to see women wearing big boots and trousers, carrying axes over their shoulders. They had a physical confidence from all the muscles they'd grown from doing all the heavy work. So I think they were kind of a bit of a misfit bunch, and people were a bit suspicious of them and wondered, you know, what they were doing. And also they had a lot of freedom, and I think that was very unusual in the 1940s for young girls to have such freedom. So a lot of the local people didn't want to have them in their homes because they thought they might lead their men astray. The ones that did take them on, they would often ask them to help do the cooking and washing around the house.
It seems mad that the women would have to come out and do all of their incredibly hard manual forestry work and then go back to their billets and do chores just to keep their hosts happy.
Despite some people's entrenched attitudes, the lumberjills had the last word. Over the course of the war, they produced more wood than ever before in British history and increased output by over 1,000%.
Today we put a big emphasis on sustainable forestry. Did they do the same back then?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the lumberjills, that was one of their main jobs. So throughout the whole war, from the very beginning, they were recruited to plant trees. So they were out there every winter planting millions and millions of trees. And as a result of that, in our country now, we probably have more wood than we've had in the last few hundred years, because they planted so many trees during that time. So yeah, we've got a good stock of timber at the moment.
It's quite a nice thought, actually, isn't it, to think that many of the forests, including the one where we're sat in now, is thanks to the lumberjills.
Yeah, in part, definitely.
The New Forest is home to hundreds of wild ponies, which have been grazing here for over 2,000 years. These ponies did their own bit for the war effort, donating blood to make tetanus shots, which were vital to Allied soldiers. From the timber plantation, I'm getting back on the main road and heading towards the very edge of the national park and the village of Bewley. Founded in the 13th century on land given by King John, Bewley is famous for its picturesque river walks, abbey ruins and stately home. But back in the 1940s, it was still one of Hampshire's backwaters. When France fell to the Nazis in June 1940, Britain found itself isolated. Whitehall ordered a secret group of volunteer spies to be established to wage a clandestine war against the Nazis, the Special Operations Executive, or SOE.
Churchill had just one instruction for this new organisation: set Europe ablaze.
Within months, the SOE became known as Churchill's secret army, and they set up training camps and finishing schools across the country, including right here in Hampshire at Bewley. Historian Dr. Kate Viggers is an expert on the SOE.
So Kate, who are the SOE?
They trained up secret agents to go into occupied territory to work as saboteurs, weapons instructors, couriers and wireless operators. And basically they bolstered the resistance and helped them get ready for the Allied invasion.
What sort of people made up the SOE? I'm imagining that it's not your typical 6 foot tall, burly soldier type.
To start off with, it was just men. It was always thought that men would be the secret agents, but they realised, certainly in France, that women would make really good agents. So you've got women as young as 19, as old as 51, could be anybody at all, as long as you fitted the prerequisites, which were to speak French fluently, to blend in. And then they used nationals as well, and the best thing to do is to use people from the country, so from Belgium and Holland. They would use people who'd escaped when the Nazi occupation had happened and come over to Britain, so they'd be trained here and then infiltrated back.
For a typical agent, what was life like?
It's pretty scary stuff, to be honest. At the height of the war, a wireless operator was given a life expectancy of 6 weeks, and they were told that their survival chances were 50-50. It's not just collaborators they're worried about. If you're a wireless operator, it's being caught on the airwaves. The minute they set up their wireless set, which would come in a suitcase like this, they put up the aerial, and the Germans could triangulate in on their signal. And as soon as that was happening, they knew they only had 20 minutes or so to be able to send their message home, get a message back as well, and to be able to pack up and get out. Yeah. And being a courier is dangerous too. You're moving around the countryside on a bicycle or on your train. You're going to encounter roadblocks or spot checks, and quite often carrying incriminating information on you as well. If you were caught, you'd be interrogated, more than likely. You could be tortured, and deportation would almost certainly follow.
In order to help the agents blend in, the camouflage section was set up. Comprised of film prop technicians, they were responsible for forging papers, IDs, and even clothing, with French zips and labels to match. They were the inspiration for Ian Fleming's Bond novels and invented a vast range of gadgets and weapons for agents to choose from.
This is one of my favourites. This is a hat pin dagger.
Blimey.
So all ladies would wear a hat, have their hair nicely coiffured, and there'd be a pin in to keep it in. You get put up against the wall, hands behind your head, whip your hat pin dagger out.
Imagine that in the neck. That is incredible.
That's a lapel knife, so that would go under the lapel of your jacket. Nobody would know it was there, but you're armed if you need it. That one as well.
Gosh. Obviously it's a weapon, but it's quite a pretty thing to look at. It's well made,
yeah,
isn't it?
they are beautifully crafted. One thing I did want to show you, dog poo or cow poo or camel poo if you're in the desert, because they learned how to use this stuff, which is plastic explosive. Yeah. Now this is completely inert until you put all the primers and everything in it, but it's basically like plasticine.
Yeah.
And so it can be moulded into lots of different shapes. So that could be put as a cow poo, dog poo, left on the road, and a German truck comes over it, it will blow the tyre, out come the Germans wondering what's going on, and then you've got the guerrillas and the resistance lined up in the hedges.
Ready to ambush
just ready to go, yeah.
Blimey.
I could offer you a cigarette, but you don't want to light it, because in the bottom part of the cigarette is an incendiary powder, which would burn your face. Or if you happen to be a railway worker and you know that a charge has been set, and you just smoke your cigarette and flick your butt into where the charge is, set something going. So, yeah, they're pretty brutal things.
I'm in the New Forest, which was a hotbed of covert operations during the war. Nowhere had more secrets than the quaint village of Beaulieu, which became home to the spy school of Churchill's secret army, the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. Trainees came to Beaulieu to learn the arts of espionage and sabotage before being dropped into occupied Europe.
What training did the SOE undertake then?
They had quite rigorous training. So once they'd got through the recruitment process, they'd go on a preliminary training course, which would involve weapons training, physical exercise, elementary morgues, always speaking in French, always having a code name or speaking the language they were going to, assault courses, all that kind of stuff. The drinks cabinet was always open on that training to see how agents reacted to getting drunk, really, and to see how they would talk and if they'd talk too much. Really things to work out if they were going to be good secret agents or not. And those who didn't make it would be ousted at that point. Then they would go on for paramilitary training up in Scotland, which was essentially commando training. This was living off the land, learning silent killing. There'd be boat work, all that kind of stuff. So really tough on the agents. A lot of them were sent in by parachute, so they would then go to Ringway Aerodrome, which is now Manchester Airport, where they would undertake their parachute training. And then some of the agents became wireless operators, and they needed separate training altogether
And what training took place specifically here in Beaulieu?
So this is where the agents would end up. This was the final training course for them. It's where agents of all nationalities came, not just F section, but there were Danes, Hungarians, Poles, Czechs, all sorts of people came to Beaulieu for their finishing training. This is where they would learn the little details of what it was like to be in occupied Europe. So they would start to learn the uniforms, not only of the Germans, but of maybe the police, say in France, and learning about the different uniforms. Here they also had the mock interrogation, which was very famous, and agents would be taken from their beds at night when you're at your most vulnerable and interrogated by their instructors. And although they didn't use physical force to get answers, agents said it was terrifying. Lights were shone in their eyes, there was sleep deprivation, and it really tested their mettle. It was immensely tough. Only the very best made it through.
Once the initial training was over, recruits would be thrown into full live fire exercises, with trainers trying to hunt them down. Houses across Beaulieu were taken over by the spy school.
It's quite a privilege being able to come and have a look here, eh?
Yeah, I'm genuinely excited about this.
And it's believed this house was used to train Polish recruits.
Look at that.
So they think that this has been here since wartime, that this is the original board where the keys are hung, and those are original keys from the 1940s. It's just amazing to see something like that.
How odd, isn't it? You think they might not have been taken off in, since 1945. Most museums can't boast something like this, but the thing is, as well, it's in situ.
And the other thing is, lockpicking was taught by the SOE, so maybe some of these locks in the house were picked apart by agents who were training to go out into the field.
I think this one, actually says explosive store.
Wow, don't get that every day, do you?
No, you don't. Oh, it's really amazing.
So, would you like to open this door?
Yeah, this cupboard.
Absolutely.
What's in here then?
So it might look like there's not a lot there, but it's thought that these might have been the personal lockers for the agents who trained here. So yes, it's just a coat hook, but to me, it's what those coat hooks represent. So we know that one of the agents who trained here was a lady by the name of Madeleine d'Amamont. We know from her training reports that she was very well respected. They said she was shrewd and practical and intelligent, and that she would make a very good agent underneath a good leader. So she was infiltrated into France on the 29th of February 1944, and she landed not to the resistance, but to the Gestapo. There were witnesses who talk about her interrogations and how she fared. And eventually she went along with some other women to Dachau concentration camp. They were held there overnight, and the next morning they were executed by gunshot. So, yeah, it's just a coat hook, but that could have been hers. And that just makes it so tangible and so real.
Over the course of the war, some 3,000 SOE agents passed through the Beaulieu Spy School. They were to prove vital to the war effort. On the 5th of June 1944, the eve of D-Day, wireless messages were sent out all over France to coordinate mass sabotage in advance of the Normandy landings. They blew up hundreds of railway lines, electricity plants and telephone poles, leaving the Nazis in chaos and paving the way for Allied victory.
There are secrets all over this county, from the more obvious ones like the Cloak and Dagger 007-esque special agents that were trained right here in Beaulieu, to ordinary people like Norman, who created the Spitfires, our frontline fighter, who didn't choose to carry these secrets around on their shoulders, but they had to, because that was what was required to keep Britain in the war. And then there's another type of secret, and that's the story of the Lumberjills, who were held in obscurity for a very long time, simply because people couldn't accept that here were a group of women, a lot of women, doing men's work. And in 34 years of learning about the Second World War, I'd never heard of their story up until this walk. But I'm really glad that I have now.